So today we are going to talk about structuring experiments in product discovery with Airbnb. I'm personally very excited to host this event, especially given the nature of this talk about discovery, something I always wanted to learn a lot. And before we get into that, just a quick introduction of myself and the company. So my name is João. I am an associate product manager at Product People. I've joined Product People almost 2 months ago. Time flies. And it's a real honor to be hosting this event today. So I have a background in chemistry and winemaking. I changed to product management a year ago, actually. And I was happy to be a part of many projects within the private and the public sector. So as I said, I've joined Product People. So a quick explanation of what we do. So Product People or Product People's mission is to help companies discover and deliver great products faster. And we do this in 2 ways. So first is through our community, which is over 13,000 members. So thank you so much for all those joining and contributing to that. We couldn't do this without you, for sure. And obviously, as a community of product managers, we do all the hands-on, unglamorous work of a product manager, but in this case, on an interim basis. So we join several clients, contributing to their missions, at least for 3 months, sometimes more. And our priorities are pretty much focused on onboarding fast, aligning teams, delivering great outcomes, and make sure we had a lot of value to that experience and to our clients and to the overall product community. So in order to know more about our audience today and the relationship between you and the topic that we're going to talk about, we've prepared a couple of questions. So if you're on Zoom, a pop-up should appear so you can answer to them. If you're on other streaming channels, feel free to answer in the comment section at your disposal. Let me just go through the questions real quick. So first one, what is usually the purpose of your experimentation? So we have A, finding a new solution to a problem, B, validating or refuting an assumption. Okay, C, anticipate changes in customer behavior, other, and feel free to specify what that is. And the second question, how are you conducting your experimentation? A, with a fixed framework, variable methods on B, C, depends on what we're testing for, and D, collaboration with a data science team. Personally, I would probably go with B for question number 1 and C for question number 2. Since I don't know much about product discovery, I know I'm going to learn a lot today. So we're just gonna see how people are responding to that a little bit. So we have A for 1 and C for 2 as well. So pretty much about finding a solution to problems and depending on what we're testing. Let me see, let me vote on mine. So B and C. I'm going to send those 2. We're just going to wait a little bit. Okay, so we got the answers here. So for question number 1, so 77% of people voted on validating or refuting an assumption. The rest of them voted for finding a new solution to a problem, which is great, starting from scratch. And for question number 2, how are we conducting experimentation? So we have 62% depends on what we're testing. We'll see about that. And also 38% with variable methods. I guess there's no one size fits all approach. So with no further ado, I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker tonight, Colleen Graneto, joining us from Airbnb. She's a product manager there. Colleen, it's really nice to have you here and really excited to see what you're going to talk about today.
Likewise, I'm excited to join you all. Should I go ahead? Oh yeah, I'll take over screen share.
Go ahead.
Here.
It's all yours.
Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to talk about structuring experiments and product discovery with you all today, and looking forward to hearing your questions and ideas that come up as we get into some of the Q&A as well. At Airbnb, we have our CEO, Brian Chesky, and this is a quote that has kind of resonated with us. At Y Combinator, we were challenged to do things that don't scale, to start with the perfect experience for one person, then work backward and scale it to 100 who love us. when we think about this advice, this isn't unique to Airbnb. Most top tech companies have some version of this, starting with the ideal outcome, the perfect experience, and working backwards, which is the essence of product management, is working towards the vision and strategy of what we want to achieve and figuring out how to do it. And what I'm here to talk to you about today is some examples for how to make this happen. A little bit of background on me. I'm a product manager currently at Airbnb, as Zhao mentioned, and this gives you some ideas of the products I've worked on throughout my career. I've worked in fintech, also with consumer products, and I have an Etsy shop, and that's what we're going to dive into a little bit more today. But what I've learned throughout my career is the importance of experimentation and the importance of doing experimentation quickly. And that's what we're going to talk about today, what it means to do things that don't scale and real examples of how this works. And I like to start us off with lessons learned the hard way, an example of when I wasn't doing experimentation and what I learned from it. And this is when I was actually starting my handmade jewelry business, which I had an Etsy shop for, and also was doing retail and wholesale. And when I was starting this business, I started with the typical thing that I learned when I did entrepreneurship in business school. You start with building your business plan. And I did, a lot of research into the sourcing and market research. I was living in Ecuador at the time, and I had met some artisans that made this jewelry out of seeds, and, friends and family that came to visit were super interested in the jewelry, wore it home. Some of it I had given as gifts, and everyone was like, "Where did you get this from?" They always got so many compliments. And I was like, well, there might be something here. And so I decided to start a business around it, and, started with figuring out how to source it, doing all the market research of figuring out what necklaces to design. And I did some surveys to figure out price points, started thinking about my business plan and analyzing how to price it in the US market. And then went about and did the ever so important marketing things of figuring out my logo and my business name, making business cards, and getting my the jewelry professionally photographed, and doing all the marketing materials and things like that. And then went and said, okay, now I'm ready. Now I can set up my website. And I decided to start with an Etsy shop where I finally listed my products. And I was like, well, that's not enough. So I was like, I have to make my own website too, since I couldn't, put as many photos or as many about me information as I wanted to. And so then I finally started selling on top of things on my Etsy shop. I started doing street fairs and festivals, going to talk to different retail stores to see if they would be interested in carrying jewelry, and, started selling as well online through my Etsy shop. And after doing that for a while, I came back around and learned more about the Etsy shop. And I saw, some more traction coming there, and figured out, well, there's probably some things that I can do to really optimize this. And I paid more attention into the SEO and the paid marketing on Etsy, and figuring out how to optimize keywords in my listing descriptions. And through that work, ended up, I think, I 5x'd the amount of sales I was getting online through my Etsy shop. And I tell this story because I spent a lot of time and energy up front. I mean, this was over the course of probably about 2-3 years on things that didn't matter. And if I look back on this and I say, well, what do I wish I had done? I wish I had experimented to learn a lot earlier. Because when I think about the process I followed, all of this upfront work I did about the sourcing and the marketing research and the surveys and all these things that I thought I needed to do, the business cards that I never used, the website that I eventually deleted, and, all of this I didn't need to do. I wasted a lot of time, and, to be honest, a lot of money. And if I was looking back on it, what I would do today is I would immediately set up my Etsy shop. I would just take photos with my iPhone and get some basic photos up there, set up my Etsy shop, do the street fairs, do the festivals, because what I found is that that's where I actually got a chance to interact with my customers. I got a chance to see what people were interested in and what they were shopping for, and get feedback live from people about, what their thoughts were, what messages resonated. what styles they were looking at, and also a chance to test prices, because I could easily swap out the price halfway through the day and no one really would have known the difference. And I really should have optimized my Etsy shop day one and like gone in and learned about all of those things. Waiting, 2 or 3 years in to do that, again, cost me a lot of time and money. And this kind of message really stuck with me. And it's been something I've continued to learn about at Airbnb, because this is typically what we do when we think about, in my past career as well, when we think about product development. This process that I went through for my jewelry business is oftentimes how we go about making decisions around a product launch, where we start up front with the market sizing and the market analysis. We do a whole bunch of customer research. We have these prioritization frameworks that we run things through. We write these really detailed product requirements. We have our roadmaps. We do some prototypes and designs to finalize the solution. We write out all of our user stories and actually build the features. And then we launch and we finally get in front of users. And do we get the results that we expect in the first iteration? Probably not. It's probably very similar to what happened to me with my jewelry business, where I spend all this time and energy, doing a little bit research here and there, refining things, and then launch. And that's when I really start learning and then iterate on it. And if I could just do that faster and just do that first, I can move so much faster and move so much more cheaply. And, that really sunk in for me with that actual tactical example of starting my Etsy shop, where it's like all that time that I spent researching and planning was, to be honest, a waste of time and effort, because I really could have learned just as much by those few simple actions or those experiments, and take that learning to actually put it into something that's scaled. Now, this Etsy shop and the jewelry business has more just stayed as a side hobby. I ended up not deciding to make this like a full-time business. I realized as I was doing this as well that the fashion industry and jewelry specifically wasn't necessarily for me. I didn't really enjoy going to retail and wholesale shows and trying to figure out how to actually make this bigger than an Etsy shop. And there was a lot of issues with the import-export and working with the artisans back in Ecuador. And so decided to just keep this around as a hobby for a few more years. And then end of last year, decided to just close it down overall to free up time to focus on other things. But I learned a lot of lessons along the way. And this biggest one here was that importance of experimentation, and how a lot of times what's stopping us from doing it is these mental roadblocks of the safety that comes with preparing things and feeling confident, and feeling like we actually have some productive output along the way, where the things that we can really do to learn quickly are oftentimes really scrappy and are about, in some cases, getting out of our comfort zone, especially when starting a business. But I think those same lessons carried through with me when I'm thinking about my product as well. And so wanted today to think about, well, how do we do it another way? So taking that example of my Etsy shop to also show you some of the things that I learned and got to experience at Airbnb as well, that showed me, how this applies not just with starting a company, which is still a product essentially, but also in terms of how we do product experimentation on a day-to-day basis. And this is all about experimentation. And this is the fundamental, when we say do things that don't scale, it's essentially running experiments for us to figure out what actually resonates. So then we can take that and figure out how to actually give it to all of our customers in a way that scales. And the important lesson that I've learned at Airbnb is that this is almost like a different part of your brain, where our immediate reaction a lot of the times is to say, oh, this isn't possible, that this can't work. And we automatically edit things down and we get stuck with just optimizing or just taking small steps forward. But when we talk about this, do things that don't scale and experimentation, it's also a mindset shift, where it's like, before we edit, before we constrain, let's ask ourselves, how might this be possible? Or what we must believe for this to be possible. And then structure experiments to learn that and figure out what actually could work. And then once we land that, figure out how to scale it. And that's almost a different part of our brain, of figuring out how to actually make this possible for hundreds of thousands or millions or hundreds of millions of people. And when we walk through it, the example that I love to share is when I was part of the experiences business, I joined the team about a year after public launch, when we were coming out of the tail end of international expansion. And for those of you who don't know, this was Airbnb's second product, where we moved into activities and things to do on top of places to stay. And when I joined the team, one of the big things that we were focusing on is how we could show the unique quality of our experiences in our merchandising. Because what we noticed is that the things that were unique about Airbnb experiences, the fact that they were a lot smaller groups, that they were with hosts that had unique perspectives, they had insider access and expertise, that wasn't coming through in our merchandising. When you pulled up different travel sites and looked at like the big red bus tours that drive around cities, and you look at Airbnb experiences, you couldn't necessarily tell how they were unique. The only major difference that popped out, to be honest, was the price. And so we were struggling with this problem. And this is a perfect example of doing things that don't scale and structuring experiments. So what we did first is experiment and learn. What did we need to show in our merchandising that actually communicated the uniqueness of the experiences? And what we did was we had Airbnb photographers. So Airbnb employees go out and shoot the footage and take a lot of photos of various hosts, like some of our top hosts leading experiences. And we had Airbnb employees, Airbnb designers create the listing pages for those selected experiences. And we used that to figure out what worked through a lot of usability studies, things that we did in product as well, to figure out what about the merchandising actually helped us communicate the uniqueness of our experiences. And I have an example here of one of those hosts that we worked with. Name is Fire, and she's now in Miami Beach, but she used to be in New York. And I have a link here in the notes, and I'll share that, where you can actually see, the merchandising has changed since when I worked on this. It's been like quite a few years. But this shows a lot more about the host. It shows the host story and why it's unique, that insider access, that expertise. It also has a lot of footage and video showing what you do on the experience. So you see a lot of footage about what the guests are actually doing, so that you can feel, just from looking at the merchandising, that you're already seeing a glimpse. It's like a teaser reel of what the actual experience is, so that you have your expectations set of like how unique it is and what exactly you'll be doing and why this is so special. And so it took us a bit of time to do this, right? It's not like we got it right on the first try. And that's where I think a lot of people, you don't just run one experiment. We're running tons of experiments to figure out and learn, because the other part is also figuring out how we feature different experiences. And so I'm talking about just one specific experiment here, but there was tons of different experiments that we were doing as we were thinking about merchandising comprehensively, but this was more specifically focused on the content. And after we figured out a little bit more about what that formula was for what works, that's then when we moved into this different stage of, well, how do we actually scale this on the product? How do we take this formula that we figured out, and that formula is like, well, what works? What types of pictures? Like I was talking about, the host-centric perspective, showing the actual activities, showing guests doing the activities so people can put themselves in their shoes. So once we have that, what's that kind of recipe for how this could work? And how do we do this at scale? It doesn't scale for us to go out and shoot all of the video and all of photography for all, at this point it was 20, 30,000 experiences that were on our platform. So we needed to find a way to actually do this with user-generated content as well. And, how do we actually categorize all of that content that we get from the host community and automate it, so that we show the content in the different ways that we figured out works in terms of how we display it to guests. So that was a separate, almost problem to solve, is once we figured out what merchandising resonated, how do we actually collect and then share that merchandising at scale? And that's where we started to work things into the product, where you'll see a lot of these tips and the things that we learned about what resonated in the guidelines for how we get hosts to add their user-generated content. So it was like, when we think about explaining the importance of the merchandising to the hosts and why, it's great to have photos that include people, that have, yourself connecting with the guests, that show guests having fun and engaging with one another, that we show the interactions, that they're not just like staged selfies, right? Where we see more about like the authentic experience, where we show the composition, we show where the guests are, what we'll do, what we'll make, what the activities are. And then just thinking about how to get high quality photos, because that was really important, and as well in terms of things that we learned in our experimentation. And you can see here, these are examples in the actual product itself. When the host is setting up their experience, it gives them all of these tips, and then it also gives them a little bit of a framework for how to add their photos. And it also allowed us to then tag the photos of like, here's the host photo of like the kind of the shot of the host really in action. Here's the photo of the guests engaging in the experiences. Here's a close-up of something that they'll be doing. Here's something more about the location. And so we could actually tag some of these photos with what they were about to figure out how to show them on the merchandising pages, because we had a lot of more interactive things with like videos and carousels and things that made it a lot more immersive for guests. So that was something else that we found was really important when we were doing our experimentation. And so all of these things started coming together. Was there a question? Sorry. So yeah, all these things started coming together. And, we had, as I mentioned, tons of experiments kind of pulling together there. And what I wanted to share was not only those examples of, what I learned the hard way from setting up my Etsy shop and how I could have done experiments to expedite my learning, to show an example of experiments that we did run and helped us learn, but also for you to take away a framework for how to set up experimentation or better experiments in your work. And the frameworks that we find really helpful that I've learned throughout my time at Airbnb are pretty simple. And it starts with this how might we question, which you might have heard before. And I think it's really great when we're thinking about setting up experiments, when we identify what we need to learn, what our assumption is, what our customer behavior is that we want to validate. I love seeing the responses to the polls there. And I would check, you could do experimentation across all three of those things. And oftentimes the experiments are very variable. They look very different because we're saying, how might we learn about this thing that we need to learn about in the fastest, cheapest way possible? And, a lot of times we jump to what I did with my jewelry business, right? Well, let's do a survey. Let's do a high fidelity prototype. Let's do all of these things. And one of the things that I've learned in my career that applies to all of product, not just experimentation, but especially experimentation, is that there's never only one idea. And the first idea is probably not the best idea. And the way to get better ideas is to invite a lot of ideas from the beginning and to make it more quick so that we're not, again, overly editing or censoring our ideas. And so one of the other frameworks that we use a lot is this concept called Crazy Eights, where you give everyone individually 2 minutes to come up with 8 ideas, and you just do a quick sketch or a word or whatever it is. And then everyone does a round table and has like 1 or 2 minutes to share their ideas. And that gives you a chance to start building on ideas. And if you have like 5 or so people, you walk away with 40 different ideas potentially on how you might be able to craft an experiment. And that really pushes the creativity and the innovation, where, we could do things really quickly to learn a lot faster. And if I had used this framework when I was starting my Etsy shop, again, I probably would have landed on, well, just sign up for a street festival. That probably would have been one of the first things that I did, setting up an Etsy shop just with very basic stuff, not feeling like it needed to be perfect, just get started. And so some of it is just taking that first step to actually get started and get, it doesn't have to be something really, really big that we have to learn. It's just how we learn and start collecting that information. Because when I talk about what we launched with merchandising, it was a collection of tons of different insights that came from a lot of different experiments that we ran. And we did all of this work in about 4 months. And so, it can happen really quickly. And a lot of the time when we follow this kind of approach that I shared before, without the experiments, it's taking months, if not years. When I talk about my Etsy shop, that was like 2 or 3 years. So I want you to think as we close out this and switch over to Q&A, what's one thing you need to learn about your product and how might you craft an experiment around it? Maybe you don't have to think of the experiment right here and today, but what is something you might take back to your team in terms of thinking about how to come up with a good experiment to learn that thing that you need to learn about your product to help de-risk your launch and make it more successful. And with that, thank you, everyone. We'll switch over to Q&A. And if you do want to keep in touch, happy to add me on LinkedIn, or I also do a newsletter on my website, ColleenGraneto.com. Happy to keep in touch. And if we don't get to your questions in the Q&A, feel free to send questions over. I love hearing continuing questions. And then also if you give this experimentation, any of these frameworks a try, I love hearing how it goes.
Thank you so much, Colleen. We're starting to get questions already. Let me just share my screen.
Perfect.
Let me just share my screen and try to find. Okay, got it. Okay, so we're arriving at the Q&A. Great. So, okay, this is dedicated to any questions that you may have. Also, if you're on Zoom, feel free to raise your hand as well. We kind of like when people talk as well. That's great. And if you're on any other channels, feel free to write your questions down. We're going to cover all of that. And to give you some time to think as well on your questions, I'm just going to share a few more things about Product People and the things that we do before we get into that, if that's okay. So just talking about use cases. So like when does it make sense to go to Product People? So for any company, whether we're talking about if you need an interim product manager to cover for a permanent position or a parental leave, also if you need a product coach or consultant, we can coach your team, create and streamline processes as well. And also if you need a product discovery lead, what we just talked now, so important. So we can help you discover the next impactful initiative or product and run a low or no code pilot at MVP. And we have many successful cases in companies like Zalando, Squad24, Tier, and many, many others. And it's also great to receive so much positive feedback from clients. And this is one of the values that we strive for and work really hard every day to really solve for the clients and make sure everyone's happy with the value that we add. And it's great to see our vision and our goals from striving for a fast onboarding and delivering great products faster happening as we deliver the work that we love so much. And obviously this wouldn't be possible without this amazing team. This picture actually gets bigger every time I look at it. So we're a very diverse team. As you can see, our headquarters are based in Berlin. So we're actually registered in Berlin, but we have people all over Europe, and everyone is so talented and such a diverse set of backgrounds, and it's really good to count on everyone. And as you can see on the bottom right, you can see our logo, which is empty, meaning that we're always looking for more people to join us. So if you really know someone who would be interested, or if that person is you, we're always looking for more talented people to join our ranks. And it's really good to really be a part of this community. And feel free to send applications via LinkedIn or via Greenhouse directly, which is where we work on our applications. So as you can see on this link, bards.iu.greenhouse.io/product-people, and we'll be waiting. So I guess we can jump now to the Q&A. We seem to be having some questions. So let me just check on that. So on Zoom, do we have questions on Zoom? We don't. I'm not seeing anyone raising their hands. So maybe I'll just jump to the other channels. So starting with the question number one. So someone's asking, how do you balance product strategy, planning, and experimentation? When to plan and when to jump into experimenting?
Great question. This is a tough one. And what I would say is like, the experimentation has to happen to help you come up with the plan most of the time. And, this gets tough. Why I say this is a tough one is because you can't always define experiments because you don't always know what it is that you need to learn when you're getting started. And so it's this little bit of like the chicken and egg thing that happens. But what I recommend in thinking about this, a framework that I apply is thinking about how you divide up your roadmap in terms of, and I think about the roadmap as how you're investing your time and your people that you have on your product team. And so what we generally will do is divide up the roadmap and align at a high level of, well, we first can't forget about bugs and tech debt and infrastructure work that needs to happen. So let's make sure we carve out time for that. And then thinking about the rest of it of, okay, well, what are we really confident about in terms of things we've either experimented on previously and we've have really well refined, or for various different reasons, we have these kind of large pieces of work that we're really confident about that we're ready to start building and building at scale, and getting those on the roadmap and making sure that we leave time to actually do the discovery as well, to answer those questions of, well, when we finish these things, what's coming next? And even within those things, we're still going to need to refine them further and break them down. And the analogy I like to give for this is thinking about your product process like searching for gold. And, you know, being in Silicon Valley, San Francisco for the last 6 years, that was gold rush country back in the day for the US. And, you know, when you think about the process of searching for gold, it very much is like your product process, because what you first do is you go out and you sample areas like dirt all around to figure out which areas show high signal of actually having gold in them. And that's what we're doing when we're thinking about this process of experimentation, of figuring out, well, what is it? What are these levers that we might be able to pull on our product that are really going to get us the growth or the monetization or the engagement that we're looking for? And, you know, what we're doing there is figuring out where some of these ideas might lie. And then when we find that signal, when we find that mix of like, hey, this has a high chance of being promising, then we start going deeper. And if you know gold, you know, like the old traditional way of searching for gold is dumping a whole bunch of that dirt in a sieve and then shaking it with water. And all of the dirt's going to fall out and the gold stays in the net. And that's really what we're thinking about with product discovery, is searching for those gold nuggets in terms of those big things that we know with confidence are going to have the impact that we expect on our product. And those are the big things that I'm talking about that we want to make sure we set aside time on our roadmap for. But we also need to set aside time for that process of sampling the dirt, that process of putting a bunch of dirt in a sieve and shaking it with water to actually figure out what those things are that are going to have promise in terms of the goals that we have for our product, whether it's growth goals, monetization goals, or whatnot that are kind of cascaded through the organization. So, you know, this may vary depending on where the product is in its life cycle. If you're a very early product, you're going to have to do a lot more experimentation and learning because you have a lot more things that you don't know. If you're a later stage product that's more mature, it's not that you know everything though, because your customers are changing, your product is changing, but maybe it's a little bit less because you do have a little bit more certainty and a little bit more data, more easily accessible around things. Hopefully that answers the question. Let me know if there's any follow-ups.
Of course. We're actually, a lot of questions are coming now. Trying to prioritize
the floodgates open.
Yes. Okay. So another question is, how do you think about testing small increments versus taking larger and bolder bets?
So I think it goes back to what we were just talking about there, is that I am okay placing larger and bolder bets, but I do want to run experiments to de-risk those, right? Like my Etsy shop, for example, I was investing a lot of time and money on this bet that this jewelry was going to resonate and that people were going to buy it. It worked out. I mean, it wasn't huge, but, you know, I made a decent amount of revenue from it, and, you know, was able to do revenue share with like the artisans back in Ecuador, and like also learned a lot myself. But I've spent a lot of time and money on this bet that I could have had a lot more confidence in, and I could have actually learned a lot more without spending as much time and money. So I wouldn't think about it as the size of the bets you're placing, but more about de-risking those bets and shaping them before you pump all this time and money into them. And, you know, that's the lesson. I actually keep the business cards from my company in my office for that reason, because I printed all these business cards with my logo and my company name and all this stuff, which is a complete waste of time and a complete waste of money. Because as I mentioned, I never used them. And it's that reminder of, it felt like I was doing something. It gave me like comfort, but I can get the same amount of comfort of learning something, right? Just because it's not like an actual output, but it's a learning or an insight. A lot of times it's actually even more productive than, a big kind of material output that you can see being realized. And so again, it's not about not placing big bets. It's about thinking about how you can de-risk those or shape them to be more successful before they go out into the world, as opposed to waiting till they're out in the world to actually learn those things and then iterate on them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so more questions. So I have this one. So are there any cases where we should simply implement and not experiment? How should we prioritize if we have so many pending experiments?
Yes. So all of this, all of the experimentation, all of your product work still needs to be framed by the goals and the outcomes that you're trying to drive, which comes from, the business and the product strategy overall. So when we think about first, how we decide as product managers what to focus on, it boils down to that. What are we trying to achieve? Because any idea could be viable, and some ideas are really promising, but we have to narrow that down even further. Not just that the idea is promising, but does it help us do something that's really important right now, or is this something that we might want to consider later? A great example is like early stage companies oftentimes have to make the trade-off. Are we focusing on growth and engagement or monetization? It's kind of hard sometimes to do both at the same time. And so while there might be really great monetization ideas, those might be for later, or vice versa. If we're really focused on monetization, then, maybe we need to put a little bit of pause on some of the really big growth ideas. And so a lot of that boils down to what the focus is in terms of what the business outcomes that we're driving, and use that to then think about what experiments we're going to run and what we're going to put on a roadmap. And the second thing I would put in there is thinking about what is the most risky if it turns out to be false. So when you think about these things that you don't know, it's the unknown unknowns. It's like the really risky things that, we not only are not sure about it, but if we're not sure about it and it turns out to not be true, or it turns out to be different than we expected, it potentially blows up the entire idea or blows up the entire thing that we're working on. So to distill that down, I think when you're trying to figure out which experiments to run, focus on, which things are going to be most closely linked to the outcomes that you're trying to drive, and then which things are the most risky, meaning that if they turn out, number one, you don't really know much about them, but if they turn out to be different than what you expected, it adds a ton of risk to the product decision that you're making.
Great. I hope that clarified the question. So another simple question: how does an experimentation team look like? Like, who's included in that?
Same product team that you work with. So this is why I say, like, experimentation, we want everybody as part of it. Now, this is generally where there's a lot of writing about dual track agile from different thought leaders in the product industry. I'm happy to recommend some resources there. But when we think about, it's your same core product team. When we think about experimentation, it's generally being led by design, research, and product together. But I still want engineers, especially the lead engineers, participating, because they bring a lot of perspectives to the table, different things that we could try. And so it's the same stakeholders, it's the same group that also is working on, when we actually find out these things and structure deliverables that we're actually going to build as a result. That's where engineering generally takes over. But again, we want that cross-functional team involved in all steps, even though different functions might be leading different stages. Doesn't mean that there's not active participation from other functions. So, and experimentation can also include business stakeholders, not just people in the product org. So maybe marketing is working with you, maybe sales. If you want to do some like we've done some things where we are like testing things out from a marketing perspective, or when we were doing the merchandising thing, we were working really closely with our marketing teams because they were creating a lot of the creative content, as were our creative teams. And at Airbnb, there isn't so much sales teams, but I can see examples where you can just craft out new positioning by doing a sales pitch slightly differently, where you're able to do really small scale things with internal teams as well, where they can actually help support outside of doing things within the product org.
Great, fantastic. Thank you again for another answer. So, more questions. So, thoughts on how to test, or methods to test desirability for a product on a very niche global target market?
I would go back to this. I mean, I can't necessarily give an immediate answer because it depends on, number one, what you're testing for. So that's a tough one. I think what I would go back to is that how might we in the Crazy Eights on bringing your experts who know what you're trying to learn and who know your product together and brainstorming ways to structure those experiments. So what are we trying to learn, and do the how might we in the Crazy Eights around what experiments we might be able to run. I mean, some of the generic frameworks for experiments are the kind of concierge type approach where it's like, we did this also in early day experiences where somebody was actually crafting the experience for you. We also did a lot of things, employees would go on the experiences to vet the quality. There's the thing also called Wizard of Oz, where it looks like it's working, but it's actually someone behind the curtain doing it. So the founding story of Zappos is a great example of that, where he did what I wish I had done with my Etsy shop, where it's like, just take some quick photos, slap up a website. And what he was testing is whether or not people would buy shoes online. And so he actually went to the store and bought the shoes and sent them to people, which obviously doesn't scale, but was helping to test things out. And that's like an example of the Wizard of Oz, where it's like, it looks like it's working, but behind the scenes, it's really something that's not scaling. There's also things you can do from like a demand test, or it's like the fundamental part of like what Kickstarter is, and these things where it's like, here's an idea, would you buy it? Very similar to what Elon Musk did with the Tesla Model 3, where it was like, here's pictures, will you give me $1,000 deposit for the interest in buying this car? And he got 3x the number of deposits that they were expecting or forecasting, which said, yep, there's demand for this car, let's pull up production timelines for it, which obviously had consequences. But those are some examples where it's like, you're doing these creative things to test for the demand, this Wizard of Oz, the concierge. I've also seen even like a great example is like doing a fake door test in your product, where this is how back in the day Spotify tested for whether or not you'd be willing to pay for the service. If you remember early days, it was like, would you want to pay to get rid of ads, right? And then you could even test how much you're willing to pay. And it's not that you can do it today, but it's like, if you're interested, give me your email and we'll let you know when this is available, right? That's a demand test and a fake door test. So there's really creative ways. I know some of those are in product. I'm using some examples that are from like, high level companies launching, or industry examples that we're all aware of. But if you think of that concept of that fake door test, this Wizard of Oz, this concierge, these demand tests, it might give you some ideas on testing out the desirability or the viability of some of these ideas in a very quick way. For my Etsy shop, what I would have done is the street festival, or even just go, to some stores and try to sense interest, where it's a very low risk, very easy thing to do, and where I'm going to learn and actually see if there's some potential there very quickly.
Fantastic answer. The next question actually resonates with me a lot, because I come from a background that working with innovation. And so the question would be, how do you help create a culture of experimenting more if there's hesitation to change current ways? I mean, this is so like there's so much depth to it.
Yes, this is like the culture change questions are where it gets tough. And this, with culture change, I say apply your product mindset as well. What is the problem with the current culture? what are the consequences of not doing it? So, a lot of times what I ask teams to do is do a retrospective on a recent launch and what went well, what didn't. And, experimentation, my guess is probably could have helped us avoid some of the things that didn't go well. And use that as an example, right? Where we're grounding the suggestion, not just because it's good process hygiene or so-and-so companies doing it, so we have to, but more what's not working today and what are some ideas for how we might do this better. And not even just being locked on experimentation, because there might be other things that come up, right? When we talk about Agile, it's all about continuous improvement and inspecting and adapting. And so being open to what some of the other ideas might be for some of the cultural changes. And so grounding that change in a problem as well, I think is helpful. And then the second thing I think is what I try to focus on with organizations is setting my goals as learning, not necessarily output. When we're measured by output, we're incentivized to just do things. And they may not always be the best things or the right things or the most impactful things. And a question I always ask is, if I told you I launched 35 features last quarter, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Who knows? If I told you I launched one thing last quarter, is that a good thing or a bad thing? We don't know. We're measuring by output. 35 sounds better, but 35 might actually be bad, because maybe I launched things that, even if they didn't add value, if they're just neutral, I have to support them. And that's going to take away time and energy. And maybe I ended up confusing my user, or maybe I even launched something that did bad, like it actually took away growth. If I'm measuring by just output of the things that I've done, then I'm measuring by something that's not really necessarily in line with what we want to do, which is have impact. And so when we think about the chances of us having impact increasing, when we think about our goals as more learning goals, where we're collecting these insights and collecting this confidence, essentially, that we are having better product sense and going to have a better product strategy, then that starts to correlate a little bit more in terms of the impact that we want to have. And so that's where I start to think about, how do we structure our goals as a team, especially when we're new at this, around learning and learning these things that are very risky, that are big unknowns that could potentially derail our product later on. And if I need to help explain the value of why that might add value, well, let's go through and do some retrospectives on past launches that didn't go as planned. And I have plenty of those in every company I've worked at, right? Like, even if you do really great experimentation, there's still surprises, because you never know everything when you're making investments, and things also change. And it's through doing those retrospectives and learning and coming up with ways to change our processes and try new things that help us to improve from a process perspective in terms of building better products as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we still have 10 more minutes. We can fit maybe a couple more questions here. So the next one would be, like, did you have challenges in getting buy-in or showing value inside your product department in regards to experimentation and really getting the stakeholders to start doing them?
Yes, I mean, that has always been a challenge. I think for me at Airbnb, it's been a little bit different, because it is a mindset that's set from the top. Brian and Joe, our CEO, and then Joe, co-founder, and Nate. Nate was an engineer. Brian and Joe are designers, and this experimentation is very much design thinking, and it comes with this mantra of starting with the ideal outcome and working backwards. That is something that comes from all of our leadership, and so it is ingrained in our culture. Even when you look at our core values and things, like Brian's talking now a lot about how one of the most important things to be a candidate at Airbnb is demonstrating curiosity. So there is some benefit of having that set as the established culture for the company, but there are still, times where it's human nature to feel, to focus on those things, to sometimes, jump over and be like, feel more confident about things than we do, having confirmation bias, and focus on more like kind of productive outputs as opposed to some of these more ambiguous activities that might not have like a concrete output that we can put on a roadmap in a neat little box with a date on it, of when we're going to deliver something. And so, there is always that mindset shift. Again, it might be a little bit easier if it's already ingrained in the culture, but it's still something to set up in terms of best practices. And a lot of times people are looking for, tangible ways or frameworks to fall back on. So it's not so ambiguous. When we just say experimentation, it's like, well, what does that even mean? But if we give small things like doing the how might we exercises and as brainstorming, or thinking about leaving some space for that exploration as part of our roadmap, those are just small little changes where we can give people a little bit more structure and a little bit more frameworks around how to do it. I've also worked at companies where this was brand new, where it was not something that they were used to doing. And so, it's what I say is kind of also starting small and just introducing small things and, making that migration slow. Because some of these, it's not like big bang. It usually isn't going to happen overnight.
Fantastic. So just to close with the last two questions, this should be a simple one. So what are the next steps to unsuccessful experiments? So what do you do?
Yeah. So I think, the thing I ended with is that how might we in Crazy Eights is a great way to get started. I think what I've seen with people, like crafting experiments is we tend to add too much to the experiment. And then it takes a lot more time, effort, and money to actually execute than it needed to. And again, go back to my Etsy shop. So that how might we in the Crazy Eights, I think, are great ways to start getting some of the creative juices flowing. And then what I would also recommend is reference some of those case studies that I've talked about in terms of, there's a lot of things written in the industry now of like stories looking back on companies that were getting founded and examples of that experimentation where you can leverage that and look at those case studies as well to spur some creative thoughts.
Fantastic. Okay, so time for the last one. So this is a big one, so I'm just going to read it out.
The big one for last.
Yeah, it's true. Last but not least. So one of the things I hear a lot people talk about is how easy it becomes to keep experimenting, looking for a perfect result instead of focusing in recurrent learning, small improvement. So how do you approach deadlines on your experiments to focus on the highest leverage goals?
So that's an interesting framing of the question, because I would even back up to just the structure there of like, if we go into experimenting with an idea of the result that we're looking for, that's probably not experimenting. That's just confirmation of something we've already decided. And if we've already decided it, there's no point running more experiments, because then we're just confirming we were right. And we're already going into that with a biased view of trying to confirm the decision that we made. And so in those cases, unless you're trying to change the decision and gather information to sway the decision, then that's different. But if we're going out with a result already in mind, then we're not really experimenting. And so when we think about experimenting, it's a lot of things around like the beginner's mindset, where we're open to learn, we're open to looking to see where different things will go. I think what we're also looking at with experimenting is recognizing that we're not going to ever know everything 100%. And so we need to know when we have enough information. And that's hard because you're never going to know everything. And actually, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And so that's when you actually get a lot of anxiety, when a lot of times you can trust your intuition there because you know enough that it's going to guide you in the right way. And so when we're thinking about these experiments, there is never a perfect result that comes out of it. What I'd say is like we should take a step back and make sure that we're not just running experiments to validate something that we've already decided. When we're looking at experiments, we're trying to help ourselves make a better decision. And so we want to withhold making that decision until we've collected the additional information. And then when we think about how much information we need to collect, which translates into how much experimentation we need to do and what the level of fidelity of that experimentation is, it's also a question about risk. where we think about, two things I would think about is, number one, how much time do you have? Is there something external that's pushing where you have to make this decision quickly? Because, all these product things boil down to decisions. And if yes, then you're probably going to have to move forward with less information than you would like. If no, if you have time, then you can potentially spend that time doing more experimentation. And so the first thing to think about is that urgency on how quickly you need to make this decision. And the second thing to think about is the risk, which is in terms of, can you undo this decision? This is the Amazon, the one-way and two-way doors, right? If I can go through the door and if I don't like what I see, I can go back, then we don't need as much information because I can undo it very easily without a lot of consequences. And so we want to structure as many decisions as we can and make them two-way doors where if we don't like what we see, we can come back. But if it is a one-way door decision, meaning when I go through the door, it slams shut behind me and I have no way of turning back, then we probably need more information. Now, that helps give an idea on thinking about that urgency and that the consequences of making the wrong decision, so to speak, of whether you can undo it or not, in terms of thinking about how much experimentation you might want to do to collect more information to help you make that decision with better confidence. But recognize that you're never going to know 100%. And this is why I say product managers will always be humans, is because there is an intuition component to it. There is a product sense component to it. And that's where there's a little bit more art than science of knowing when the time is to make the decision, and recognizing that even when you launch it, you're still going to learn things because there's no way to have known everything up front. The goal of experimentation is to at least increase our confidence, even if we're not going to know everything. And so it's that it's kind of, you have to just wipe this idea of a perfect result out of the thought process, because you're also making decisions that kind of put you down different paths, which also close off other paths. And you can't know, if I had made this decision differently, what would have changed in the product? You will never know. And so a lot of times there isn't even one right answer. There might be 10 right answers. And the question is which one are you going to pick based on the probability and the confidence and insights that you have to date that are pushing you in one direction versus the other. And this is why, one of the really important things as a product manager is this comfort with ambiguity. Is everything's ambiguous, and being comfortable with that fact that there is no perfect result and there might be multiple answers to the question. And so the job is to just uncover what the best answer feels like, or the best decision. I should take that back. It's not about feels, it's about the insights that you collect and the things that are pushing you in one direction versus another.
Colleen, thank you so much for being here. I think we answered all the questions, but if we missed some, I think we're going to be able to answer them later. You can always reach us out through the appropriate channels. And thank you so much for all those who joined us today. We have these meetings recurrently, so we're having the next one on Thursday morning. So feel free to follow that on Meetup. So you feel free to join us through there. Also, if you want to chat with us, feel free to actually reach us out on Telegram. And if you're keen to supporting our project, go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/productpeople, and feel free to support us from there. And thank you so much for coming. And until next time, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.